Hello, my name is Quintessence. I'm a developer advocate at PagerDuty, and I'm here to talk to you today about preventing heroism or reducing work today to prevent work tomorrow. To get started, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I was inspired to give this talk in the first place. One day I was walking, listening to Developer Tea podcast, and the person was interviewing writer Dan Heath about his book Upstream. And he started his interview by telling a parable, or a healthcare parable as he called it, and it went a little like this. You and a friend are having a picnic beside the river. Suddenly you hear a shout from the water, and there's a child drowning. So you go into the water, grab the child, and bring them to the shore. But as you're putting them down, you hear another shout and another child, and so back into the water you go. While you and your friend are continuing to pull children out of the water, you just start struggling to keep up. Until once you look up and you see your friend getting out of the water and walking away, and you say, "Where are you going?" "I'm going upstream to tackle whoever is throwing these kids in the water." Okay, so upstream. Upstream work is the proactive and preventative work that reduces the need for reactive or downstream work. And when I'm talking for the remainder of this discussion, I'm going to be using these terms in that sense. Now, what does this look like for us? Because we work in IT, we don't have healthcare parables, and we're not typically diving into water, at least not for work. But we do have a culture, and we do have things that we discuss. And so now I'm going to regale you with falling downstream, the angry sysadmin. And the angry sysadmin has a lot of problems. They're usually highly skilled, and part of that reason is they're asked a lot of questions. And so they're asked questions, and they iterate and learn more each time. But as you keep inundating them with work, and it's usually the same one or two people, they get more and more skilled disproportionate to everyone else, which only feeds the cycle of them getting pegged for more work. They also work overtime because these ad hoc requests aren't actually what they're kind of internalizing their day job is. Depending on what they're doing, it might be Kubernetes, it might be the actual sysadmin stuff of, access controls for individual users within a company. But whatever it is, they're not doing that because they're doing this. So to compensate, they do that after hours. It's not ideal. But because they're just amazing, customers want to meet them. Because why would you want to meet the people when you can meet the brains? And unfortunately, that applies internally too, because you're brought into the meetings as the subject matter expert. Why talk to somebody else when you can talk to the person who can give you an answer, and hopefully you'll take their advice? And all of these things basically mean we've created Brent. And for those who haven't read the Phoenix Project, Brent is the protagonist, or one of the characters, that's basically a placeholder for the angry sysadmin. He gets all the questions and pulled into all the meetings, and he's the only one who knows anything and doesn't have enough time to train anybody else, and so he never gets to free himself. But if he did have time to train somebody else, that would be his upstream work. But let's talk a little bit about Brent, or more specifically, our Brent-A-Like. So what does this mean? Brent's stressed. Not even a little bit. And they're going to have a lot of impact from that stress. You're going to have some internalization about what high stress environments are like, because even if you're watching this or listening to this and you're maybe not normally in a high stress environment, right now we might be in a high stress environment. There's one or two minor global crises happening concurrently that are kind of in everybody's background and affecting us all in different ways. And that is what a high stress environment is like to a varying degree. So the angry sysad is angry. That's where the trope comes from. That might be self-explanatory, but they also experience a lot of very intense other negative emotions that impair them, like resentment and so forth. And because of all of this, their relationships are very strained, not just personally, but professionally also, because they're trying to work with other people, and they both know they need to be asked the questions, but wish you wouldn't. And again, that feeds too. And part of it's being fed by everybody else, because maybe you don't want to bother Brent and you're really sorry, but it's just how it is because that's who has the answer. This leads to issues with Brent or Brent-A-Like's time management skills, because you might have a single person or a small team of people that have a certain capacity in hypothetically ideal situations. And now they're over capacity perpetually. And because they're over capacity perpetually, you also have a focus problem. Because when you're getting a ton of requests, they may not be prioritized well. And if you can't do the upstream work of prioritization, you're getting them all inbound at once. You might be trying to do little bits of them kind of concurrently instead of doing one and then doing another more serially. And so in an attempt to avoid the dropping balls and you're trying to divide your focus, this is actually going to decrease the overall quality of your work. There's also something called allostatic load, and this is a term that started floating around because of the pandemic in various places, phases and situations where people may be quarantining and such. Allostatic load is the wear on a body in response to long-term chronic stress. It's that brain fog you're probably feeling as well as the sleep deprivation. It's the state where you're too awake to truly sleep, too asleep to truly be awake, and because of this, you can't focus, you can't time management, you can't do intense cognitive tasks at all. But beyond the Brent-A-Like, business. Because this is a talk about upstream work and how this can impact everything. And Brent and the Brent-A-Likes, they're employees to someone. And maybe that's really bad for Brent, but if you're in a certain corporate culture, maybe that culture doesn't care if it's bad for you. They want to know why it's bad for them. And why is it bad for them? You have those diminishing returns. You have the brain fog, so you can't think through your problems as quickly or clearly as would be ideal. And so you're solving fewer problems, or you're solving more problems slower. As a result, the business can promise fewer things to anyone who's using their product or products. Or if your customers are internal, for example, if you're doing infrastructure and it's other devs, you're still promising fewer things. It's just to an internal-facing environment. When these things start to happen, you also get burnout, which is a common term that we talk about in industry. And when employees get burnt out, if they have the freedom to do so, they walk. They walk away to a situation that doesn't burn them out. So if the business is seeing these employees with these stress cycles and they don't respond, those employees leave. And that has a cost too, because you have the lead time to hire the replacement or replacements, and you have the lead time to train those replacements. And those cycles may not be short, depending on the seniority level you're hiring for. It could be anywhere from 2 weeks, 2 months, to 4 months. And then once you actually have the person, you maybe have a 90-day onboarding period, even if they have the requisite knowledge, because they're learning about your business in that time. And all of this feeds into reputation. There's a cost to the reputation too. There are two main sides to the reputation coin. On the one side, it's going to be difficult to replace people if you start earning yourself a reputation of burning them out and not caring about their wants and needs to be functional employees for you. But on the opposite side of the reputation coin, you have the customers, again, internal, external, because then they're going to have a perception when they're not getting their questions answers from support, or they're not getting features getting through the pipeline successfully. They're going to take their wealth and put it in a different company. And that will impact the finance for that business, and it's going to impact the valuation of that business. And I could keep going about this. There are whole bodies of work about stress, there are whole bodies of work about business, and this talk isn't entirely scoped to that. However, in my resources slide, I do have links to things that you can read if you want to pursue this topic more. But back to upstream and downstream. If your business, team, org, whatever, is not already focusing on upstream work, you and or your team are going to have to upsell the cultural change. But just like nothing happens in a vacuum, as the phrase goes, for DevOps, nothing happens in a silo. And with these two concepts, you need to get buy-in, right? So if you're listening to this talk and maybe you're on a team, but you do not have decision-making power, you're going to have to start thinking about your boss and their bosses, whomever you have to upsell this to, and what they might need. You can successfully start to build a business case based on the stress of the individual and the team, as well as the information about broader business impact, and start cycling through some more resources so that you can say, this is bad, and it's bad here. And once you do that, you can start to outline a plan to actually instantiate that change, which is what I actually want to get to talking about. So shifting your work. When you get started, you need to brainstorm the work. This is not planned. You don't want to say, oh, I only want to think about this work, all the work. Don't scope it, don't do anything else. Get your paper, your whiteboard, whatever you're going to do, and just start writing down tasks. They can be incredibly broad, they can be very specific. After you brainstorm for 5-10 minutes, whatever makes sense for you or your team, you're going to start categorizing by streams. Which of the pieces of work are reactive? Which of the pieces of work are proactive? Or to use the terms that I'm using, downstream and upstream, where does the work fall? For now, for this cultural shift, you can ignore anything that already falls into upstream. It's already there. That is your happy place where you want the rest of the work to go. When you're looking at your downstream work, reassess and see what patterns it has, because typically you're going to have some things that are repeating, and not all of them will cause equal pain. So you might have repetitive work that you just are like, oh, I have to run this script or put it in a cron job. Going home, and that's all you have to do. And then there are other types of reactive work where you might have a database or a cluster that goes down on the regular, and it's a huge time sink and majorly stressful and maybe requires involving other teams. And depending on how bad it is, goes to the public press, and it just keeps going on and on and on. So look for patterns and see what's repeating and categorize by pain level. But you also want to start thinking about how you might resolve these problems and switch them to the other stream. You know, for example, if you're not doing any sort of pipelining, you're doing manual deploys, building a pipeline and maintaining that pipeline for the deploys would be switching manual to automated, would be switching downstream to upstream. Typically when you're remediating reactive downstream work, it's going to be either short-term or long-term and permanent or temporary. Now in this case, the way I'm using short-term and long-term, it's not how long the solution is good for, that's the permanent versus temporary, it's how long it takes it to happen. As a quick example, let's say that you know that some microservice is flappy, and it's always flappy, so it qualifies as a relatively high pain downstream situation. But the remediation is if I delete this configuration and it no longer does this and it's only using these files or whatever. You fixed the issue. You know you can do a quick deletion and now you fix the issue. So it's a permanent solution that was quick to implement. So that's permanent short term. A permanent long term would be when people talk about cloud migrations or going from monolith to microservices. You're re-architecting something because it's legacy. And that would be long term because it's not going to be done in a day or a sprint. It's going to be done in phases. And that would be the permanent long term. When you look at temporary solutions, you might be doing something like, oh, I fixed an outage by doing, maybe I rebooted the cluster or whatever, so that was short term, but you still don't know why it went down, so you need to redress that. So the short-term solution got everything back up, and now you have to switch modes into something that's long-term so it doesn't go down again later. A long-term but temporary solution is something that totally doesn't happen ever when you write that script, that shell script that no one was supposed to use. You're just going to use it that one time. Definitely only at one time. The whole company was definitely never going to become dependent on it. It was definitely going to be rolled into the main application eventually, but it never was. And so it's still technically temporary and it's still in the backlog somewhere, but it never dies. When you categorize this work, you need to plan and prioritize. Because when you notice that some of the up and downstream tasks are going to be high pain, where you're doing it repeatedly and it takes a lot of stress, versus low pain, or you know that it needs to be done immediately because there's a massive impact versus maybe later because of the immediate things, you can start to see how you're going to stage out your work and behave accordingly. Make sure that you're capacity planning while you do this. You do not want to plan for an 8-person team when you have 6, even if you're like, oh, we have 2 job racks open and they will totally be filled soon for some definition of soon. Make sure you're only capacity planning on the resources you actually have. Because if you do get those 2 more people, that's great. Then you have shorter time, not a shorter time that you've extended into longer time. And once you have all of that accomplished, you can just do it. And I definitely avoided using a logo on that slide. Once you're doing the work, you need to start to iterate. Because sometimes things take longer to actually finish than you would expect, or they take shorter to finish than you expect, and you can add more tasks or remove tasks accordingly. But if you plan for a quarter and never revisit that during the quarter, at the end of quarter, you might be feeling some pain. just a small amount. And make sure when you're iterating, you're planning around known difficulties. Not all difficulties are necessarily painful in the way we normally think of as pain. It might be something like an internal conference that's coming up and everybody's super excited, but all of your engineers need to make demos. And if you don't reduce the other capacity, that's going to be a problem. Or this tweet that I have up on the slide right now, this person's company has what they call a pandemic tax, where they're adding a buffer into their sprints and saying, I think it says 20%, where they're saying we're reducing your workload by a certain percentage because we understand what brain fog is and we understand what stress is. So we're reducing your capacity anyway because there's something happening and we're planning for it. And that's the type of iterating and planning you want to be doing around your workload. And then once all that's accomplished, you can totally go back to not playing the goose game on your lunch breaks. But yes, how do you measure it? Because now you're thinking, oh, I can do all these cool things, but how do I validate that those cool things are actually having results? Because when you want results, you want to make sure everything's correlating. And you want to prove that there's a reason to keep doing it. Otherwise, you're going to be adding labor or changing labor. and it might not look like there's a reason to the people you're trying to convince. So let's talk metrics for a moment. How do you measure upstream work? And the reason this is an important question to ask is because since upstream work isn't a direct thing that you're holding, it's an avoidance in a way of things that you're not having happen, you're going to be thinking of your metrics just a tad bit differently. To use an example, let's say that there's an intersection. There's a lot of accidents at this intersection, so the four-way stop signs are changed to a traffic light. Excellent, but you're not directly measuring accidents that did not happen, because any individual accident may have been avoided by something else. Someone looking up, someone not trying to cross in the pedestrian crosswalk, whatever. For any individual accident, what you want to look at is a reduction in the accidents you're already tracking. And so when you have metrics, you're going to start thinking of them this way, because we have lots of like DevOps KPIs and such, but they're measuring events happened, and you're going to be using those deltas to track a correlation between events that did not happen. So some things to keep in mind with that. Really understand your needs. You don't want to say, oh, I want this traffic light, but maybe if you're not solving the accident problem, maybe you didn't need a traffic light. Maybe you didn't need to invest in building it and changing the structure of that intersection. You also want to make sure that you're measuring the actual need. So when you're saying, okay, I am reducing the accidents with the traffic light, make sure you know what you're measuring, because if you don't communicate that to anyone who's responsible for the measuring, you say, hey, measure stuff around this intersection, they're going to give you all sorts of data, and it might not help you. Some of it might be that it's not scoped correctly, where you might get all the accident data for the county. If you don't want it for the county, it's going to bury the intersection. You don't know if that specific traffic light situation was resolved or not. Or they might give you something that's too narrow, or a different type of data, like tickets given at that intersection or something. But that doesn't tell you about accident reduction either. So when you're saying, what's my question, how am I measuring it, make sure that the scope and actual type of measurement is measuring what you think it is, and revisit it in case it isn't. You also need to establish baselines. This one's hard, because if you're solving a problem that you haven't already been measuring, you're not going to get a good delta. So for example, if the light was put in an intersection where it was unknown, if there was a previous history of accidents, you're not going to be able to say accidents today versus accidents last week, last month, last year. But what you can do is start tracking now and see if the accidents are still reducing over time starting now. It's not the same type of baseline, but it's better than no baseline. And this goes back to knowing your capacity as well. Again, don't plan on resources that you don't have when you're making these measurements. It doesn't make sense to say, I want an accident reduction of 50% by tomorrow. Maybe. Maybe you'll have an accident reduction of 50% tomorrow. You might not. It depends on a lot of things. It could be the sample size. If it's a small intersection in a smaller city or town, the data set being smaller might actually drop it by 50%. But if you have a larger data set, I mean, it's a single data point. You don't know if it's actually correlating to anything. It's too short a time period to actually give you meaningful information. So make sure you're planning this way. When you understand your capacity, you can understand what rate of change means. And while you're understanding what your rate of change is, track it. Because you might think, oh, well, maybe not 50% tomorrow, but what about 50% by end of year? And maybe that makes more sense. But when you're revisiting it, as I may have mentioned a couple of times, when you're revisiting it, then you might notice, oh, but it's actually only dropping by 1% a month. It's not going to drop by 50% by end of year. But you can establish a different goal once you see that happening. It's not a nothing, it's not a zero, but you do need to adjust your goals to be more realistic. And now you're going to set your goals. So you're going to use your baseline and set your goals. If you do not have a pre-existing baseline or a known rate of change for the team you're working with, because you don't know how fast you're going to make it through your backlogs and things, you can make an educated guess for your first goal, but never forget to revisit it, because now you're paying attention. You're going to reset those goals at whatever cadence makes sense. It might be sprints, it might be QBRs, whatever it is, just make sure that you're giving a look back and making sure that it makes sense. Iterate always, because you want to make sure that the changes you're making are actually making the results you want. So if the traffic light didn't reduce the accidents, that's unfortunate. It's probably not worth the expense to remove the traffic lights just there now, but we still have to focus on the problems. Now we're iterating it and trying again. Maybe they need something else. So from that same sort of view of metrics, we're going to apply a new perspective. So there are lots of well-known DevOps KPIs. I'm going to re-mention only a couple of them and some other ones as examples to help you get started. So here are my symmetrical thoughts with service level agreements and change rate and question volume, as well as keyword mentions and unplanned work rate. And let's go over each of these in turn. Service level agreements. We know them, we love them, we don't really love them. But we make promises based on them. And so when we make promises based on them, our customers, our internal clients, external clients, whatever they are, they have an expectation. A quick and easy example, let's talk about support. Support might have an SLA of responding to emails in an hour and responding to phone calls in 10 minutes. Something like that. And you might say, okay, well, we can get that down, going back to reducing whatever is making the things get backlogged over there. You're not reducing the service level compliance because you're not compliant necessarily. You're reducing it to have a better experience. So if there are two types of work there, in this situation, if you find that the support team is unable to hit those two SLAs, they either need to be adjusted and promises adjusted so that you can communicate more effectively, or if they're meeting those SLAs but customers are still saying like, 10 minutes is a long time to be on the phone. I can't even go to a cafe to have coffee while I'm waiting, right? 2020. So when you're addressing those, you can say, I can still reduce my promises, my time promises, to a way that makes sense, even if it's not broken. Still need it to make sense. But when you're doing that, you're also doing upstream work because you're saying, what about this team? Can we change, support, whatever, so that they can make our new compliance arrangements? You also want to talk about the change failure rate. So change failure rate is typically measured for DevOps or devs when you have failed deployments that make it all the way through to production without being caught. So it's a failed deployment. If you're doing successful upstream work, maybe by pipelining if you don't have them, testing if you're not doing it, increasing your test surface, etc., all of these things, you should see a change failure rate that goes down. And so you're focusing on the results of the measurement, but you need to articulate, going back to know what you need to know, you need to articulate what you're trying to measure with this metric. So if you have a baseline of a lot of failed deployments and your first attempt at upstream work is a pipeline, watch it with that in mind. Make sure that you're scoping it to that though, because if you have a bunch of teams and a bunch of deployments and you're aggregating the data, just like the traffic light, it's not going to help you. Monitoring question volume can also be helpful. And this gets a little bit away from traditional DevOps KPIs, but around other things that you can consider to track your upstream work progress. Question volume is something that might appear either inbound through intercom to customer support teams, or on public fora, or on public or private Slack channels, however you're receiving information. Depending on what you're trying to address, question volume should decrease. You're making it clearer. Maybe you adjusted the docs because you realized that a lot of questions were being asked about the docs. Maybe you fixed a certain lack of a feature, or maybe resolved a bug as a feature. Whatever you're doing, you're going to see questions change based on the changes you're making, and you need to make sure that data's tracking. Relatedly, but not entirely the same, are the keyword searches. So question volume is more of an aggregate of certain types, but keywords can also include not questions, if this is something you're interested in keeping track of. Something like this might be, hey, I see a lot of people complaining about Terraform on our public community forum. Should fix that. It's not a question, it's a statement, but it's not a positive one. But alternatively, maybe a lot of people are praising Terraform and they're just like, oh, did you see what the team put out? This is amazing. You're so cool. I want to be like you. I wish they were saying that. But when they make those changes, you're going to see the keyword mentions with like the temperature of the mood increase, and you can say, oh, we need to do more of that. We need to support that. Unplanned work rate is something that is a very key cornerstone to downstream work, because since downstream is reactive, in an IT scenario, reactive is mostly alerts because something happened that you didn't plan for. Unplanned work is a pretty direct measure of broadly everything that's hitting you. You'll need to break it down though. Once you get an unplanned work rate, that's a number, you need to start to categorize it and see if something is ballooning, because it might turn out that your overall unplanned work rate is high, but 90% of it is specifically one thing and everything else is fine. Like, don't stress over 10 things when it's just one. It is important to track it though, because as you see your unplanned work rate drop, your planned work rate will go up. And planned work is always easier to work with because you know the scope and duration of it more accurately than something that maybe has gone out with no known cause yet. So to summarize, upstream work is proactive preventative work. Downstream work is reactive work. Upstream work reduces stress and its extended impact. Shifting and categorizing your downstream work will help you reduce it. Know what you're asking and why you're asking it so that you can define the success, quantify with metrics. If you want to do additional readings on any of this, please take a look at this slide. The link included has all the resources on it, and that same link is on my thank you slide. Thank you for watching. I'm in the chat to answer questions, and again, my name is Quintessence. Have a wonderful DevOps Day, Chicago.